Good morning, friends. We are continuing Chapter 5 this morning. By choosing to travel to the United States, the Shah was recognizing the emergence of a new world power, one whose will would shape Iranian history more decisively than anyone could have then imagined. President Truman hoped to use the visit, which stretched over several weeks in November and December of 1949, to persuade the young monarch that he must devote himself above all to improving the daily lives of his people. He was convinced that only social reform, not military power, would keep Iran safe from communism. Truman sent his personal plane, the Independence, to bring the Shah to Washington and to put him up at Blair House. Later, the Shah went on to New York, where he was feted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and to a variety of destinations not usually on the itinerary of foreign dignitaries, among them Idaho, Kentucky, Arizona, and Ohio. Companies like Lockheed and General Motors held lavish dinner parties for him. The State Department arranged for him to be honored at Princeton and the University of Michigan. He attended a football game between Georgetown and George Washington. And before the game, he was made an honorary captain of the George Washington team. At West Point and Annapolis, he was welcomed with 21-gun salutes. Behind the scenes, however, the Shah's visit did not go well. In meetings with Truman, Secretary of State Dan Akeson, and General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he insisted repeatedly that what Iran needed most was a bigger army and more weapons. He asked for tanks, anti-tank weapons, trucks, and large stores of ammunition, as well as money to pay for tens of thousands of more soldiers and advanced training for a greatly expanded officer corps. His single-mindedness was understandable. Under the Iranian constitution, he controlled the military but nothing else, so a strong army was the key to his personal power. When his hosts tried to steer their conversations to the subject of Iran's social needs, he lost interest. Akeson warned him to pay attention to what had happened in China, where the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, had enjoyed vast military superiority but lost power to ragtag communists because he had sought a purely military solution. The two sides could not come to an understanding. In the end, Truman sent his guest home without the military aid he had sought. The joint communiqué issued as the Shah departed said only that the United States would bear in mind his request for military aid. After failing to persuade the Americans to pay for the military buildup that was his most fervent desire, the Shah returned to Iran to find his adversaries better organized than ever. His agreement to cancel the results of his rigged election had shown the limits of his power. It also had another more far-reaching effect. After leaving the palace grounds, following their successful sit-in, 20 of the triumphant protesters had met at Mossadegh's house and made a historic decision. They resolved to build on their victory by forming a new coalition of political parties, trade unions, civic groups, and other organizations devoted to strengthening democracy and limiting the power of foreigners in Iran. They christened it the National Front, and by unanimous vote chose Mossadegh as its leader. With a formal organization behind him for the first time and a roused public opinion at his side, the 67-year-old patriarch now had all the tools he needed to launch his shattering challenge to the political order. Mossadegh and 6 other founders of the National Front were elected to the Majlis. In the new election, they had forced the Shah to call. Their victories marked the arrival of something new in Iranian politics, an organized, sophisticated opposition bloc, fired with nationalist zeal and confident of broad public support. Its emergence posed a considerable obstacle both to the Shah's immediate goal, which was to secure approval of the supplemental agreement, and to his long-term project of re-establishing royal power. Two opposing visions of Iran's future were now in sharper conflict than ever before. The Shah preferred weak prime ministers because he could bend them to his will, but at the beginning of 1950, he and the British needed one strong enough to force the Majlis to approve the supplemental agreement. His first choice, Mohammed Said, was decidedly unenthusiastic about the agreement and refused even to present it for a vote. After 2 months, the Shah replaced him with a more strongly pro-British figure, Ali Mansour, but Mansour also proved unwilling to fight for the agreement. The British became impatient. In April, they sent a new ambassador to Tehran, Sir Francis Shepherd, whose diplomatic experience had been in countries run by tyrants or foreign powers, El Salvador, Haiti, Peru, the Belgian Congo, and the Dutch East Indies. In one of his first cables back to the Foreign Office, Shepard reported that although the Shah had ordered Mansour to secure as soon as possible the passage of supplemental oil agreement, Mansour seemed to have no intention of carrying out his master's orders. It did not take long for both the Foreign Office and Anglo-Iranian to conclude that Mansour was not their man. They needed a tougher prime minister. Their candidate was not a civilian, as was traditional in Iran, but General Ali Razmara, who had been one of the General Schwarzkopf's most trusted officers, and had then become Chief of Staff of the army. Only a man with his fierce determination, they believed, would be strong enough to face down Mossadegh and the National Front. On June 20th, the Majlis voted to create an 18-member committee to study the supplemental agreement. The British took this as an act of defiance and advised the Shah that he must respond by sacking Prime Minister Mansour and naming General Razmara to succeed him. Such advice could not be ignored. Razmara's slight stature and ingratiating smile belied his energy, intelligence, and relentless ambition. He was a career soldier, 47 years old, known as ruthless and cold-blooded. Like most Iranian officers, he had taken advantage of many corrupt opportunities, but he was also a man of unmistakable talent. His hero was the late Reza Shah, with whom he shared the belief that Iran could rise to greatness only under the rule of a harsh, unforgiving tyrant. Unlike Reza, however, he was a sophisticated cosmopolitan, educated at the French Military Academy, and intimately aware of how important it was for Iranian leaders to placate foreign powers. He rose to power by winning their support. To the British, he promised quick passage of the supplemental agreement. To the Russians, freedom for Tudeh leaders imprisoned by Mohammad Reza Shah after the attempt on his life, and to the Americans, who were becoming more interested in the Middle East, a sympathetic ear and support in their anti-communist crusade. The Majlis met at the end of June to debate Razmara's nomination. No one was surprised when Mossadegh delivered a blistering speech denouncing him as a tool of foreign powers and a dictator in the making. Nor was there any surprise when, after the speeches were over, Razmara was confirmed by a comfortable margin. He had used his power to help the campaigns of more than half the deputies, and they were repaying their debts. Razmara took office convinced that destiny had chosen him to lead Iran back to greatness. Mossadegh believed the same about himself. So did the Shah. Only one of the three could emerge victorious from the coming confrontation. Razmara's first days in office during the summer of 1950 would have discouraged a less formidable man. The arrival of a new American ambassador, Henry Grady, sparked an outbreak of rioting in which several people were killed. No one had anything against Grady personally, but politicized Iranians had become so angry at foreign interference in their country's affairs that the mere appearance of what seemed to be a new proconsul was enough to send thousands into the streets. Prime Minister Razmara had to take this rising nationalism into account as he planned his political strategy. He told his British patrons that he could win approval of their supplemental agreement, but only if they revised it. Let Anglo-Iranian sweeten its offer, he suggested, by agreeing to open its books to Iranian auditors, train Iranians for managerial jobs, and take some of its royalty payments in advance as a sign of support for national development. This was a shrewd proposal. By accepting it, Anglo-Iranian might well have undercut the National Front and stabilized its own position for years to come. Much to Razmara's dismay, however, the British rejected it out of hand. Ambassador Shepard told him the company's offer was final, and that the only sweetener it would accept was perhaps free medical treatment of certain hysterical deputies who continued to denounce the supplemental agreement. By failing to recognize that the colonial era was ending, and that they could maintain their world power only by working with the rising forces of nationalism, the British passed up a historic opportunity. Razmara had no choice but to reconcile himself to the will of the Shah, the Foreign Office, and Anglo-Iranian. He named a finance minister known for pro-British views and resumed his campaign for ratification of the supplemental agreement. One of his key allies was a radio celebrity named Bahram Shoragh, who had risen to fame as a Nazi propagandist. During the early 1940s, Shoragh had been chief of Radio Berlin's Persian service, and he was the enthusiastic voice that brought Iranians their daily diet of news about Axis victories and the glorious future of German-Iranian relations. His broadcasts were filled with anti-British vitriol, and they fueled the hatred of British imperialism that spread through Iran. When the tide of the war turned, he mysteriously lost his job. Some Nazi security officers suspected him of being a British agent. Not long afterward, to the astonishment of his listeners, he turned up at Radio Tehran and began broadcasting lavishly pro-British commentaries. Razmara named him Director of Radio and Propaganda, and he embraced Anglo-Iranian's cause with a fervor every bit as intense as he had shown for the Nazis a decade earlier. Besides broadcasting streams of passionate reports himself, he helped Anglo-Iranians single out and bribe pliable newspaper columnists and editors. By this time, the Majlis had named the members of its oil committee. Mossadegh was, of course, among them, and at the committee's first meeting he was elected chairman. The committee met twice a week. Many of its members were no more interested in finding a compromise than Anglo-Iranian was. Manager Farmin Farmian, the director of Iran's Petroleum Institute, attended many of the sessions and later wrote about them. The committee was ostensibly set up to investigate the supplemental agreement and had found grounds for settlement, but the technical and economic aspects of the agreement were rarely raised. The deputies were not well versed in oil and were interested in it only insofar as it related to politics. Instead, they fixated on the human costs. Mossadegh dominated the proceedings. He criticized everything with great sarcasm, a technique he'd mastered in the 25 years in which he'd done nothing but carp and bestow blame. Mossadegh did not care about dollars and cents or numbers of barrels per day. He saw the basic issue as one of national sovereignty. Iran's sovereignty was being undercut by a company that sacrificed Iranian lives for British interests. This is what infuriated him about the government's willingness to compromise, and it was what made him decide unequivocally that AIOC had to go. As the weather cooled in Tehran that autumn, the temperature of public opinion rose steadily. The British, by their refusal to compromise, had managed to unite a broad cross-section of the politically active population against them. They even pushed religious groups committed to Islamic law into a coalition with Mossadegh and other secular liberals. A few mullahs, including the young Ruhollah Khomeini, who 30 years later would emerge as the country's supreme leader, refused to join this coalition because they believed that Mossadegh and his allies had forsaken Islam. Most of the important ones, however, entered into a tactical alliance with the National Front. The most influential among them was the flamboyant and impassioned Ayatollah Abolkasem Husseini, who had never been considered a great religious scholar, but who had become a central figure in Iran's anti-imperialist movement. Husseini's father, who had been killed fighting the British in Mesopotamia during World War I, and he himself was held in a British prison camp during the Allied occupation of Iran in World War II. After his release, he quickly emerged as an incendiary popular leader. Mohammad Reza Shah tried to silence him by sending him into exile after the 1949 assassination attempt, but from Beirut he ran for a seat in the Majlis and won. Popular pressure forced the Shah to allow him to return, and hundreds of thousands turned out to welcome him. In his speech to the multitude, he hailed Mossadegh and the National Front as Iran's truest patriots. Husseini was fiercely anti-Western, hated liberal ideas, and believed that Muslims should obey secular laws only if they were in harmony with the Islamic legal tradition known as Sharia. If he was a nationalist, it was only in a limited sense. He wanted Iranians to control their own affairs, but also imagined that once the infidels were pushed out, Iran would become part of a pan-Islamic commonwealth that would challenge both the Western and communist blocs. Yet, like mullahs who had supported the constitutional revolution nearly half a century before, he saw the anti-British campaign as a sacred duty. In pursuit of that duty, he plunged into politics, building his own faction in the Majlis and working tirelessly to mobilize the masses to Mossadegh's cause. Islam warns its adherents not to submit to a foreign yoke, he thundered at one rally. With the bearded holy man Husseini and the Swiss-educated aristocrat Mossadegh stoking the anti-British fire, opinion in the Majlis turned ever more strongly against the supplemental agreement. Prime Minister Razmara tried to make a speech there in October appealing for its ratification, but was drowned out by a stream of invective. After he took his seat, more than a dozen deputies rose to reply. All condemned Anglo-Iranian as a rapacious monster and Razmara as its lackey. Mossadegh was the most passionate. He denounced the supplemental agreement as an instrument of bondage, and then, in an inspired coda, turned dramatically to Razmara and told him, "If you endorse this agreement, you leave yourself with a disgrace which you will never be able to wash away." On November 25th, Mossadegh brought the supplemental agreement to a vote in his parliamentary committee. The committee assembled as usual in an anteroom in the Majlis. Bright sun shone on the light snow-cover outside. Mossadegh and the 4 other committee members who belonged to the National Front proposed the radical option of nationalizing Anglo-Iranian, but the rest of the committee was not ready to go that far. On the question at hand, though, there was no dissent. The committee voted unanimously to recommend rejection of the agreement. Events now began to take on a momentum of their own. Iranian politics was moving into uncharted territory, and there was no steady hand at the tiller of the state. Every day positions grew more polarized. No faction believed in the goodwill of any other. Discourse was conducted by insult and tirade. Have a good day, friends.